Good afternoon. This is Scott Hennig here, Canadian Taxpayers Federation. I'm joined by David Seymour. David Seymour is the leader of the ACT Party in New Zealand, and he's a bit of a household name and a celebrity in his in his homeland of New Zealand. However, actually, some readers of our magazine, The Taxpayer, might recognize him from his time living in the Canadian prairies, working for free market think tanks like the Frontier Centre for Public Policy and the Manning Centre. David left Canada in 2014 to return to New Zealand, where he ran for Parliament for the Association of Consumers and Taxpayers, the ACT Party, where he won the sole seat in the riding of Epsom, which is a suburb of Auckland. He became the party's leader later that year, and he's now in his 8th year as leader of ACT and now joined by 9 colleagues in Parliament. David, it's been a few years since we last chatted, but thanks for making the time. And I want to go back to ask you about your time in Canada, actually. What brought you to Canada, and why did you stay so long after you learned how cold it was in Regina?
Well, g'day, Scotty, and it's great to see you again. Look, it's funny how small the world is. The Association of Consumers and Taxpayers, the ACT Party that I lead now, has its genesis in the Canadian taxpayer movement. So in the early 90s, a bunch of provinces went broke or nearly went broke. The taxpayers movement sprung up in the different provinces and, of course, eventually became the CTF. But that inspired Sir Roger Douglas, the Minister of Finance in the 80s in New Zealand, to come back and form the Association of Consumers and Taxpayers after he visited Canada in the early 90s. So, all of these things are connected. And I got introduced to the Frontier Centre, which was run by Peter Hawley, who came out of the taxpayer movement. And they said, well, look, you're supposed to be an electrical engineer, but you spend half your time doing politics. Why don't we just pay you to do politics? And that was a kind of dream come true. Now, of course, I didn't know anything about Regina. I knew a lot about Canada. And I was really, Canada's got a cool reputation. I just assumed I was going to like Vancouver or Toronto or something like that. Anyway, I got to Regina and it's got a charm about it. And when I found out my rent was only $300, I was really happy. And then when I found out that was monthly, I was even happier because we pay rent here weekly in New Zealand and we have some of the most expensive housing in the world, which is another story. So look, it was a nice place. Working for the Frontier Centre and later getting to work with Preston Manning at the foundation. It was like doing a second degree and it trained me. And yes, it is cold. But the good news is I never complain about the cold in New Zealand. So, everything has a plus side.
Well, that's excellent. Yes, you're right. Peter Hawley worked for us for a while and still runs the Frontier Centre. So you worked on a lot of public policy files, David, when you were in Canada, of course, currently do. But if we just think about your time in Canada, what stands out as your favorite issue, your campaign or victory that you worked on?
Well, strangely enough, it was the taxi battle, because I just couldn't believe that there was a restricted number of taxi licenses in a town. And in Winnipeg, they had the same number of taxi licenses they issued in World War II. Now, unkind people might say that Winnipeg hasn't grown since then, but nevertheless, it seemed like a crazy policy. And I remember writing at the time, I said, look, sooner or later, the technology will emerge where people will just order a ride off their phone, and it'll be impossible for the regulatory authorities to stop. Now, Uber didn't exist then. There was an app called Avago Driver out of the States, which I'm not sure what happened to that. But nevertheless, that story that technology has by and large been a good story for freedom. It gives people choices and options and information they didn't previously had. It makes things like the modern taxpayer movement that you run possible. This is a really good news story for those of us who want a freer society. So that was great. But we did a lot of stuff on those crown corporations. I mean, I just don't know why they bother with those. The healthcare. I think unfortunately, healthcare in Canada is not a way of getting well. It's a way of proving that you're better than America. And I think that is a really, really poor reason to run a state monopoly in healthcare. So look, there were a lot of frustrating battles there too. But flat taxes and taxi regulations, those were good times.
Yeah, well, too bad you didn't start your own app. We could be driving, you could be calling Seymour's right now instead of Ubers.
Well, exactly. We could be doing this interview on a yacht.
That's right. So moving to New Zealand, it has a mixed member proportional system for its parliament, which I would say probably not a lot of Canadians are very familiar with how that works. So how does a mixed member proportional system work, and what are the pros and cons of such a system?
So, there's a lot of information in the name, mixed member proportional. So there's a mixture of members, what you would call traditional riding representatives, or what we call electorate MPs. They're like me. I'm elected to represent a geographical area, in my case, a very small patch in the center of Auckland, but a very densely populated area. And then there's also a different kind of member. So there's a mixture, and those are list members. And what happens is that when the electorates are all filled, the Electoral Commission, who run the elections, they then say, okay, well, in order to get the proportion right, we will add a certain number of list members of parliament to each party. And the proportions are decided by a second vote. So when you vote, you get one for the representative of your electorate or your riding, and one for your party. So when the votes are tallied up, there's the electorate members are in automatically, and then to maintain proportionality, additional list MPs are added to each party. To give you a tangible example, the ACT Party, we got about 8% of the vote. So we're entitled to 10 members of a 120-seat parliament. And of course, I won an electorate seat. We didn't win any other electorate seats. So to maintain proportionality, we were given 9 list MPs who came off our party list. And that's why there's a mixture of members. There's me as an electorate MP and 9 others as list MPs to maintain the proportionality. So look, that is probably, it's a while since I've had to actually explain this, but hopefully that makes sense. In terms of the pluses and minuses, I mean, for a starting point, I never get too head up on this. I've been to a lot of countries. I've been lucky to travel a bit around the world. I've never been to a country where you get off the plane and people say, man, we love our electoral system. Just never happens. Every system has problems, and you can go into arrows and possibility theorem and all that stuff about why that is. It's mathematically difficult to make everybody happy with an electoral system. But anyway, in terms of the advantages of this one, I think one thing it does is it does increase the range of people who get elected to Parliament. So, there'll be people who maybe wouldn't win a seat by themselves, but nevertheless, they have a coalition or a constituency of interest, a voice that should be represented in Parliament. And they are therefore, more likely to get in. So that's one thing that, some people would see as a plus, others would see as a minus. It certainly allows for a more competitive marketplace. Once you've got 2 parties, or once you've got a first past the post system like in Canada, it's very difficult for upcomers to actually usurp the incumbents, because really until you get to about 20 or 30% support, you're not really viable. You don't have a hope in hell of winning a seat anywhere, so why would you bother? Whereas, there could well be a legitimate group of people, maybe only 1 in 10, but they can get representation, and from there they may grow. So I think it makes for a more competitive political system. I think where it's difficult is that in terms of getting a coherent reform agenda, it is very difficult because you're going to need 2 parties to agree, and that makes it very difficult to get stuff done. But of course, a lot of people would see that as an advantage. And I think the reason that New Zealand selected this system back in 1993 was precisely because we'd had such a tumultuous period of reform. Some of the reforms, I think, were very good and very necessary, but of course, only because it was so bad beforehand. So, yes, it certainly slows down the rate of reform and offers stability. but also, you got to kind of hope that you like the policy settings you have to begin with.
Hmm. So, and you mentioned having to be in sort of a coalition at all times, and your party is often, when they're in government, working with the National Party, which would be kind of the equivalent of the Conservative Party in Canada. You mentioned you were also the sole electoral seat representative or winner. So you first won in 2014 in Epsom, and that's been a pretty good seat for ACT over the history since 1993. Why has that been a good seat, and how does that work with your coalition partner?
Well, basically, it's just math. So the Epsom electorate is a very educated electorate, a very astute electorate. It's a very wealthy electorate. It's got a lot of very discerning people, and we've been able to sell the basic deal that if you vote for the national candidate, then that doesn't help you. He's already going to be a high-ranking National Party member who's going to be in Parliament on the list if he doesn't win the seat. If you vote for the ACT candidate, then you get an extra person. So if you love a good deal and you love a 2-for-1, you'd be crazy to vote for the other guy. Vote for us. And the next thing about it is that we have what's called the coattail rule, where if you win a seat, then you get all of your additional votes, your party votes count. You get those proportional list MPs topping up. If you don't win a seat, then you've got to get 5% to be in Parliament at all. So, by winning a seat, you could effectively bring 3 or 4 extra people into Parliament. So the proposition for people in the Epsom electorate is really simple. You vote for the national guy, you get the national guy. You vote for ACT, you get me, and potentially another 3 or 4 who wouldn't have been there anyway. Now, at the moment, ACT has been polling at historic highs, well above the 5% threshold, as high as 17% last year. And that means that, that later calculus is not so relevant. But the other thing is, you got to do a good job. So, people know that I'll stand up for them. And, there have been many high profile cases of doing that. So at the end of the day, a strategic message is good, but so is actually answering the phone and helping people.
Well, actually, I was going to ask you about that. I've seen your polls, upwards over 17.5%, and your personal popularity polls, I think, have put you second only to the Prime Minister right now. What do you attribute your party's recent success and your recent success to?
Well, I think there are some really big problems. It's all around the world. Democracy is in decline because politicians have basically promised, we're going to take 30% of your income, regulate everything you do on the property we haven't requisitioned off you, and then we're going to make everything okay. And people look at that and they say, well, actually, not really. The education system, and you just take education. People who, have really highly educated middle class and upper middle class households, they show up at school, they can already read. They're not the kids that need an education system. Kids that need an education system, they disappear by the time they get to high school, disappear off the rolls, can't read, can't write. In New Zealand, we got serious problems with that. Now, and actually a lot of countries do. Now, you can go through just about everything and say, well, okay, I gave you a third of my income. I let you make the rules for everything else. But do we really have equal opportunity? Do we really have a society where people can get ahead if they basically do the right thing? Of course we don't. So, you wonder why politicians are so distrusted, because that basic promise, 30-year income, fix all the problems, has not been delivered on. It hasn't been delivered on for decades now. And what ACT does is, first of all, we're just quite honest about that. We're quite honest about everything. And then we try and give better solutions. So, we're not afraid, and this is what people tell us in focus groups and elsewhere. You don't take yourself too seriously. You tell it like it is and try and be constructive. I think that's the best you can do. And we've got a track record of delivering it. So, charter schools, legalizing end-of-life choice or euthanasia-assisted dying, whatever you guys call it, VAD, I think. Those things show that not only it's not just talk, we actually deliver on this stuff, even sometimes when we only have one MP in the whole Parliament.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, I do want to ask you about those. Before I get to it, though, Just in terms of the electoral system, again, New Zealand did away with the upper house in 1951, so that was well before your time. But having seen how Canada's unelected Senate works, and even the United States' elected Senate, do you think New Zealand should have an upper house, or just leave well enough alone?
Um, well, I mean, first of all, just to talk about New Zealand has the most anemic constitutional arrangements of any country. I mean, we have no written constitution, no upper house, no states or provinces. We basically have one elected chamber that, I used to joke we could theoretically legalize murder, but then I had to stop saying that during the end of life choice campaign. That's another story. Now, but it's true. Now, I think one of New Zealand's most urgent needs is to get, a regulatory standards bill, which I've sponsored, and the opposition or the government have voted down, but to get some quasi-constitutional protections for property rights and require the government to follow due process, identify the problem, identify costs and benefits, and who pays the costs and gets the benefits before they make a law. So there's all sorts of things we need to do. But when it comes to Canada, I don't understand what your Senate does or why you have it or anything like that. It seems very, very odd to me. And even when I lived in Canada, I couldn't work it out. So I just ignored it mostly. So it seems to me that, you should probably either get rid of it, which would be more honest than having a sort of highly paid rubber stamp, or you should start thinking about, well, what's the purpose of an upper house? And it's got to be to create some sort of change to the way that laws are made, because it's the policies, the real outcome that matters to people. So, would it be better, for example, if each province got to elect 5 representatives? You have a Senate of 50, and people in PEI would have way more power than people in Ontario or Quebec. But maybe that's a good thing, that it would actually put some brakes on the majority trying to run roughshod over people's basic rights. I don't know. But it seems to me that where you are now is the worst of all worlds. You should either get rid of it or really strengthen it.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. While we're on the topic of Canada, I mean, you're obviously very familiar with the province of Saskatchewan. In fact, you wrote a book about it in 2011.
Wow.
In your current role, how often do you draw on your Canadian knowledge to help you guide policy recommendations?
Well, Canada was such a great education for me. Like I say, it was like a second degree, and I think just having an understanding that the way things are in the country where you live is not the only way. There are whole societies that have had fairly similar challenges and problems, and have often gone about trying to solve them in completely different ways. And so that's been enormously useful. I think, probably the other way around, but I look at the way that First Nations are treated in Canada. I think it's just atrocious. I think the idea there's a government department to try and minister to a race of people is just the most bizarre thing I've ever heard. And I think something that really urgently needs to happen is that Canada needs to move along the spectrum to having equal rights. And I don't just mean political rights. I mean the right to get a decent education. That's not happening on most reserves, or at least it wasn't when I lived in Canada. If it's improved in the last 5 or 6 years, I'll be really thrilled, but I doubt it has. So, those are the sorts of things that I reflect on. And I think, Canada really needs to have an honest conversation about its First Nation relations.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned this just in a minute ago here about some of the issues that you've worked on. One was, and one they gave you a little more notoriety too, was on the your bill on assisted dying. Why did you take on that issue, and what has changed in New Zealand since the passing of your bill?
Well, first of all, it's a basic right. If I'm dying in pain, if I'm one of those unlucky people, I'm not going to live on and suffer great pain and indignity to satisfy your morality. Why should I? And what sort of person would expect me to? People say it's a Christian thing. Well, the best advice I've had from that was from a minister who said, look, you can't seriously think that when you're suffering in pain, Jesus is standing at the end of the bed saying, you must suffer some more, my child. I mean, that's ridiculous. So, it's a basic right. And it's also a judge of a society. How do you treat the most vulnerable people? Well, to expect people to suffer on to satisfy some conception of morality is crazy. So it had to be done. When it comes to the various fearmongering, I mean, I just challenge my opponents. It was a 5-year campaign. They could never come up with anything that stacked up. They say, oh, it's people who are disadvantaged, and the opposite is true. And, disabled people can't make up their mind or try and kill themselves. I mean, it's just so offensive. That it's a slippery slope. Well, actually, that's not true, but it probably should be, because there's still people excluded. So, the arguments are cut and dry, really, if you base on the empirical evidence of what actually happens when it's been legalized. In New Zealand, to answer the second part of your question, it was only legal on the 7th of November. We had quite a long campaign through Parliament and then a referendum to ratify it publicly, and then a year after the referendum. So, it's basically 5 years, it's actually almost 7 years since I started on this.
Wow.
What we know is a few dozen people have used it since the beginning of November. But in terms of the effects of that, we don't really know yet. We assume that they alleviated their suffering, and they were very happy to do so.
Another issue that gained you some attention was the issue of gun control. Obviously, a very emotional issue after the terrible shooting that left 51 dead in Christchurch. The Labour government of Jacinda Ardern rushed through legislation that banned a lot of guns. You were the sole vote against it. 2 questions on this. One, what was your primary reason for opposing the legislation? And secondly, how difficult was it to stand alone when all of your colleagues in Parliament and the media were pushing for this bill at a very emotionally charged time?
Oh, the primary reason was that the process was wrong. If it's true that we want to do honor to the 51 people who lost their life, and if we want to improve our policies and ensure it won't happen again, at the very least, they should have waited until there'd been a proper investigation inquiry to find out what went wrong, because it's pretty hard to fix a problem if you don't know what the problem is. So it was opportunistic, it was rushed, it was bad law, it was all of those things. It was a collapse of our basic democracy, which was ironic because our democracy is what was under attack. And so the right thing to do was to put a marker in the sand and stand up to that and say, this is actually wrong. So how hard was it? It was very, very easy, because, if you think about the reasons I've just given, standing up for due process, democracy, good policy making, and honor of people who lost their lives, well, that's one of the easiest things I've ever done. Now, admittedly, the rest of New Zealand Parliament and the press and many in the public lost their proverbial shit, but, that's not my problem.
Oh, that's great, David. I love that answer. We're now 2 years after the gun ban and the buyback process took place in New Zealand. What's changed in New Zealand? Has it made any impact on crime and these kinds of shootings?
Well, I mean, thankfully, the kinds of shootings that occurred in 2019 are incredibly rare, and there's only been a couple of other remotely comparable incidents in New Zealand history. So, thankfully, they don't happen very often anyway. In terms of overall gun crime, we've got a real problem. We've got a real problem with gangs generally. We're seeing a lot more violence and shootings. The police, for the first time in New Zealand history, the majority of serving police officers would like to carry weapons all the time, which, New Zealand, alongside the UK, is almost unique in the world. Not having armed police. That's one of the really nice things about New Zealand, is that most of the time when you see a police officer, they're not carrying guns. I remember when I moved to Canada, I was like, my God, these people have got guns everywhere. But, unfortunately, that things have got a lot worse. Now, there's a second question. Is that related to the government's legislation? There's no direct links, although a couple of things. One is that they severely undermine trust in the police amongst the licensed firearm community. Second thing is they banned about 250,000 or 250,000 centerfire semi-automatic rifles. They did a buyback and they got about 60 or 70,000. So somewhere out there's about 180,000 banned but not recovered centerfire semi-automatic weapons. And you would have to assume that some of those have fallen into the hands of gangs and are now causing the trouble we have. Whether the gangs would have got them anyway, I don't know, but certainly things have got worse, and there are some tangential connections between the government's lawmaking and where we are now.
So Canada's going through something similar. We had a series of shootings that left 22 dead a couple years ago, and the Trudeau government rushed through a gun ban and working now through a buyback program. What lessons should the Canadian government learn from how New Zealand did their program?
Well, ultimately, first of all, you need to take your time and diagnose. And this is the same with all policy, right? Take your time, diagnose the problem, work up some options, pick the best option, and then implement it. I mean, it's actually not complicated. You just have to take the time to do it. Now, I don't know a lot about the Canadian situation, but my basic suspicion is that we're going to have you're going to have a real difficulty if you focus on the types of firearms instead of the types of people. The thing about firearms, as I've learned in the last couple of years, is that they're fiendishly technical, and trying to write down on a piece of paper what type you can have and can't have just creates an endless game of whack-a-mole. And that's before the courts get hold and start interpreting it. So, rather than focusing on, does that firearm have the right screw in the right place, which is what our government's tried to do, and I suspect yours will be, you've actually got to focus on, do the right people have firearms? Because one of the problems we have is that the licensed firearm owners, that they're treated like criminals, but meanwhile, the actual criminals are all firearm owners. And we need to keep the guns with the people who've been through the proper process, and the criminals, they shouldn't have any guns. That's what we're trying to do if you want to stop gun violence. Now, we haven't focused on that. We've just focused on the types of guns. And if you guys focus on the types of guns instead of the types of people, you'll get the same outcome. I guarantee it. And I've seen that guy Trudeau, and I can guarantee he'll get it wrong.
Yeah, and that's currently what's happening right now. So you're bang on.
I haven't read anything about what's happening, so there you go. That's just, or in Canada. So it's not hard to predict these things out when you've been around a while.
No, that's very true. Changing the topic to COVID, New Zealand's had some of the strictest COVID-19 restrictions in the entire world. Do you feel that New Zealand's lockdowns have been effective?
Yes and no. I mean, you got to look at New Zealand. The number one thing about New Zealand is it's a really remote chain of islands. Like, it's 2,200 kilometers to Australia, and Australia is quite a remote place. So, we had a massive, massive strategic advantage. We were the 63rd country in the world to have a case. And people say, oh, England should have done what New Zealand did. I say, you crazy? Like, Heathrow's the busiest airport in the world. You can't just stop it. And you can make similar arguments around most of Canada. Now, we had a real difficulty in that it was easy to isolate ourselves. And initially, that was the right strategic approach, because you cast your mind back to March 2020. And the thing you notice is that no one knew what was going on then. There were plausible estimates that it could kill 80,000 people in New Zealand. We now know that was never true. But, at the time, you just say, well, if 50% of people get it and, 2% of those die, then that's 50,000 New Zealanders. Now 50,000 people dying, that's pretty serious. So we were right to close the borders and isolate and have zero tolerance. The problem with New Zealand's response is that as we started to learn more about the virus, we did not take the kinds of steps that were required to change up our response. I mean, we are still right now in January 2022 using basically the same response that we had in March 2020. I mean, 2 years, we've gone nowhere. And the costs of that isolation, the isolation's gone from being our greatest strength to our greatest weakness. So, we're now in a position where we've spent so much more to save a year of life from COVID, or a quality adjusted life year, if you want to be really technical. We never spend that much buying cancer drugs. All the time, the New Zealand government says, look, if we bought that drug, we could probably save some people from cancer, but we won't. All the time, we have terrible road accidents, being a mountainous country. All the time, the government said, well, look, we could straighten that section of road and stop people driving off and dying, but, actually, it's just, we can't afford to do that. When it's come to COVID, we've had an open checkbook. We've borrowed tens of billions of dollars. We've printed tens of billions of dollars. We've created massive inflation that effectively like a 5% tax now on everything everyone buys. Mm-hmm. And yet, there seems to be no end to how open the checkbook is for COVID. So, we have not managed to balance all of the needs of New Zealanders. And that includes, it's not just kids missing school and people going broke and the government borrowing money. In our case, we've taken the most draconian approach of banning New Zealanders from returning to their country. It's the most extraordinary thing. There are tens of thousands of New Zealanders right now who have to go online every few weeks and basically enter a lottery to win a spot to come home. It seems really weird to explain it to someone internationally, but that's actually the policy.
Wow.
And meanwhile, we've got thousands of people who actually have COVID who are isolating at home, but you can't fly into New Zealand, get a taxi to your house and isolate for 2 weeks. You gotta win a spot in a government-run hotel where they then keep you for 10 days before you can get out. It's honestly insane.
So what's the end goal? Do you see there being an exit plan for the current restrictions?
Well, the restrictions can't really be removed until they fail. So, it appears Omicron, and by the way, it's also really interesting to look at the other country. New Zealand is now in an elimination block with one other country. And in this 2-country elimination block, one of them's a communist dictatorship and the other one's called China. Now, just as with China, the elimination strategy will fail because the virus will become more infectious over time and eventually it will just get through. Delta almost did it. Omicron will do it. And it'll get to the point where the elimination strategies failed so badly that people throw it out. But as long as people think it might work, it seems to a lot of people to be, irresponsible and for the government politically impossible to abandon. So it actually has to be destroyed by a variant of the virus before it ends. And then, obviously I and others will be arguing strongly for life to just go back to normal.
Mm-hmm. How long do you think that, what's the timeline on that, do you think?
Well, Omicron, as of yesterday, has been confirmed circulating in the community, and it appears to be circulating much more widely than testing has revealed. So I'd give it a couple of months.
Interesting. I think we're maybe just a little bit ahead of you, although I may be less optimistic that things are going to turn around. We'll change topics here for a minute. You mentioned it earlier, school reform. You worked a lot on school reform your first couple of terms. What is New Zealand's history with charter schools, and what needs to be done to improve education choice in New Zealand?
Well, in New Zealand, we had a revolutionary government in the 80s, which, in the words of Milton Friedman, effectively made every school a charter school. So what was called Tomorrow's Schools in 1989 made every school self-governed. We had then what we call bulk funding, where every student basically gets a capitation fee. And so the community governed school can run itself its own way and get paid according to how many students choose it. And we really got pretty close to a market system of education. But the one thing you got to remember is that the rot always comes back. So a number of things happen. One is they introduce school zones, which, whether or not you like them, they're very difficult and unfair to remove once they're in place, because people, literally have $250,000 property value based on being on one side of the street or the other, depending on which school they go to. Then the government got rid of the bulk funding, so the bureaucracy in Wellington sort of had its revenge. And at that time, in the late 80s, we had a Ministry of Education of 900. When I was in government last a few years ago, it was 2,600. After 5 years of the Labour government, it's now 3,500. So the bureaucracy has grown, and they micromanage every aspect of the school's funding. Of course, the big problem is always the teacher unions, that, education is a people business. It's like saying to a people business, we want you to reform and innovate and get better results, but you can't do anything around your people. You can't fire anyone. You can't change the terms of employment. And you say, well, that's in a people business, that's impossible. So look, we had a good system, and then the real factors of control and centralization gradually seeped back. So what I did, and first as an advisor to a minister, John Banks, and then in my own right as the Undersecretary for Education from 2014, we set up charter schools that really were what the tomorrow schools should have been. We said, if you've got a good idea, you can come before an independent board who will, either authorize or not authorize you. If you're authorized, we'll pay you per kid. The management structure is up to you. You're outside the state sector, so any collective agreements with the teacher unions do not apply. And the most extraordinary things happened. We got so many different schools from people from different backgrounds, different styles, kids that were so engaged, kids that had been racially attacked by teachers because they were Indigenous or Maori people, escaped the state system and went to schools run by Maori. We were really, people talk about fighting racism, we really were fighting it. Kids being told they wouldn't amount to anything because they're a Maori kid. Totally disgusting. And we were getting them away from that. So it was tremendous. But unfortunately, the big problem we had was that, of course, these schools were opposed by the teacher unions, because they could see this would be the end of them. If we had every single teacher on an individual contract where they could be fired for not performing, there'd be no need for the stupid teacher union. So the Labour Party, beholden to the unions, it's pretty much the only thing they've done in education. And they didn't even close them. They closed them down for one day and reopened them the next day, requiring union contracts, and with no bulk funding, and with the standard cookie cutter governance system that state schools have to have. So, it's funny, people talk about charter schools. You got to get down to the detail. Who controls the money? What are the terms of employment? Who can expand and contract? And, unfortunately, there's so much evil deep in the bureaucracy that no matter how hard you try, it always comes back. But we've got new ideas, and next time we're going to fuck them properly.
Okay, good. You were talking about that being a product of the 80s, and referencing also Roger Douglas, who was one of the founders of ACT. And yep. I'm sure some people will be familiar in Canada with his work and his books. What would you say is the most important reform from Roger's time in office that has paid the most dividends for New Zealanders today?
Wow. Look, there's so many. I don't really think you can. It was a package of economic liberalization. So, for people who might be unfamiliar, we got rid of all agricultural subsidies. We got rid of nearly all tariffs, all import controls. We floated the dollar. We got a broad-based, low-rate taxation system to replace a crazy system with basic personal exemptions and all that kind of crap. What else happened? We got a well-designed GST instead of a sort of hokey sales tax that was low and on everything. We liberated the education, totally reformed the public sector, privatized most of the crown corporations, made corporatized the ones we didn't privatize. Yeah, like I don't know if you can pick the most important thing out of that, then you're doing better than me.
That's a fair answer. It's a fair answer. Um, our colleagues at the New Zealand Taxpayers Union have their Jonesy Awards for government waste. How hard do you drill into your caucus that they are not to get one of these awards?
Well, I mean, if you stand for ACT, you're probably in little danger of that as it is. So no, I don't really, but it's great to see that they've imported that Canadian Taxpayers Federation practice, and Jonesy, for people who might be wondering, was a rather obese New Zealand politician who went around the country giving out money to a range of people, not his own money, of course, some of whom may or may not have had family connections to himself. So that's why he's named after the Jonesy Award.
So what advice, though, on a more serious note, what advice do you give to advocacy groups like the Taxpayers Union on how to best get action on their issues?
Hmm. Um, I think the most important thing is that you have to be saying things that are salient, meaning that they have relevance to people's lives in a way that are easy to digest, and ultimately a narrative that's easy for politicians to join into. So you've got to think a little bit about what are the concerns that people have. What is it that people really want dealt with, and how can you put that in a way that suits and their style and their tempo, and then how can you deliver that message in a way that's easy for them to digest? Because ultimately, the most informed voter and the least informed voter, they both get the same government, so you'd be a mug to spend too much time. So you've got to make it easy for people. Now, I would say, people are very concerned at the moment around the world about the cost of living. So can you link it to a salient issue? Is the government contributing to increases in the cost of living? When the government wastes this money, you got more dollars circulating and no more goods to buy. That sounds like prices are going to go up. So, if you can tag things to salient issues, and also bear in mind that most people are not political junkies.
Mm-hmm.
So like, for every person that is out there emailing their MP, there's 100 people just getting on with their lives. And it's important as politicians, we're listening to them too. And what the issues are for them are not always, I don't want to have a vaccine pass or something. It's more likely, shit, I just wanted my life to continue and make sure I can pay my bills.
If you were prime minister tomorrow, what's the one policy you'd steal from Canada and implement in New Zealand?
We'd love a free trade agreement with the Americans. Can we have NAFTA?
Yeah, well, Trump tried to end that already with us, but we managed
Yeah,
to hold
yeah.
on
Well,
to
he
it.
wasn't good. He wasn't good for free trade, was he?
Not at all. Not at all. Okay, well then let's flip this around. What's one policy that New Zealand should what's one policy from New Zealand that Canada should adopt?
Oh, just your end to all agricultural subsidies. That supply management is just crazy.
All right, I'm gonna go a little lighter here for you, David. You gained a bit of notoriety in 2018 when you competed on New Zealand's Dancing with the Stars. I think it's fair to say that you were maybe not the most skilled of dancers, but the nation really embraced you as the underdog, kept voting you back even after the judges were maybe not as kind. How did that experience? How did that happen that you got onto the show for one? And are you glad you did it?
Oh yeah. Well, I got on. They rang me up and asked if I'd do it. Oh, I'm thrilled I did it. This is one of the once in a lifetime experience to compete in a televised celebrity dancing contest. I mean, how often do you get to do that? And it was a great challenge. And it was interesting. People are busy. They use shortcuts to assess their politicians. And of course, the format of the show is that it's about 4.5 minutes between ad breaks. So you've got 90 seconds of preview of video taken during the week's rehearsals, 90 seconds of dancing, and then 90 seconds of talking to 500,000 people. So, which in New Zealand is big. So I I said the video part was easy. As long as I could get through the dancing, I got to talk to people. And you're getting through the dancing part. That middle part was the hardest part, that's for sure. But from my point of view, it couldn't have been better.
And so, do you, I guess, would you say that you definitely are getting recognized more now than you were before?
Yeah, doing that did make a big difference. The two things that make a big difference to recognition have been well, that and also just election campaigns are a time that people are more focused on politics, but also things like the end of life choice campaign, for example, that sort of stuff. That certainly makes a difference as well.
So, are you ever being asked to twerk when you're in the streets? You run into people?
Occasionally, but that's all best left in the past.
Okay, a couple more questions for you. One being that we talked about earlier about your party rising in popularity, and you have in the past had sort of a formal agreement, a coalition agreement with the National Party. How does that work when you're both in opposition, when both you and the National Party are in opposition? Do you still work together in a coalition, or are you competing to try to usurp them and replace them as the sort of the alternative to the Labour Party?
Well, I think we're both really focused on how to change the government, because the government we have now is doing a lot more damage than most. In a bunch of areas that we don't necessarily need to go through, but there's a real sense that this government is quite transformational and not in a good way. So that's the main objective, is change the government. There's not actually a lot of scope for cooperation on that. I mean, you need good ideas to win people over. And if I had ideas like that, I would probably use them for ACT rather than give them to the Nats, and likewise, vice versa. So, there's not really a lot of scope for cooperation. I mean, we generally don't attack them because I just don't think that helps anyone. We save our attacks for the government, but our goal is to put our best foot forward, and if we have good ideas, we're certainly going to use them for ourselves rather than give it to those guys.
Mm-hmm. Oh, fair enough. When you're driving around Epsom, what's playing in your car? What are you listening to?
It depends on the time of day. So, in the morning, you definitely need morning radio because they're, telling you what's going on, or their version of it anyway. And then in the daytime, I might listen to some radio stations, more music radio. And then in the afternoon, you're back to drive radio. So yeah, it depends. Morning and afternoon, news radio and probably music stations in the middle of the day.
What's your all-time favorite movie, David?
Ooh, that is very difficult. I actually rewatched Dunkirk over the break. And that is an extraordinary piece of cinematography. It really is amazing. I don't know if it's my favorite. It's got to be one of the best. Probably The People versus Larry Flint. Oh, what a great story of free speech advocacy.
That's an interesting answer. I like that. Is there a book you've read lately that you'd recommend?
Yeah, I've recently read a couple. One is Rationality by Steven Pinker. That's the runner-up. But Cynical Theories by Helen Buttrose and James Lindsay. That is an extraordinary book. And I think people, particularly people who are interested in a freer society, but are completely perplexed by what is going on in the civil service and the universities and academia, some of the media, it's really important to understand what metastasized Foucaultian postmodernism has done to the university setting. This idea of relativism, that there are many different views and they're all equally valid, that there's no universal truth, that there's no universal humanity. I mean, I did a philosophy degree along with engineering. And I was aware of this stuff when I was at uni 20 years ago. I didn't think anyone would take it seriously. Well, it turns out a lot of people have. And, once you understand where these people are coming from, at least you can start to think about how you change it. But it certainly shows, all through many of the most important institutions, we now have people who literally don't believe that there is an objective reality, who think everything is just a narrative, and that the way to a more just world is to silence the narrative of people that look like me, because we're somehow the baddies, and promote other narratives based on how oppressed people are. And it's mind-boggling, but it's also very, very dangerous and divisive. And I think reading that book, Cynical Theories by Buttrose and Lindsay, is a really essential step for people worried about a free society, who are ultimately liberals in the correct sense of the term liberal, the classical liberal sense. We need to understand why liberalism is under threat.
I'm going to put that on my list. David, thanks so much for joining us. This has been really interesting. It's been good to see you again and chat with you, and wish you, it's been great to see your success, and I wish you nothing but the best and future success in both electoral and your personal politics and your personal, your personal life as well.
Yeah, well, you too, Scotty. Great to see you.
Hi, I'm Scott Hennig, President of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. If you've got another minute, I'd like to ask you to think about the one person you know that would really enjoy listening to this podcast. Do us a favor and do them a favor and send them a quick note to let them know about it. At the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we believe there is power in numbers. That's why we've worked so hard to build an army of taxpayers who are ready to push back. And we did it because people like you shared our work with that one person that they knew would really appreciate taking part. Thanks for listening. And thanks for doing your part to make Canada a better place.